Hi, everybody. My name is Tony Ann Marcolini. Welcome to It May Interest You to Know the podcast. And I have I'm super excited about my guest today, Scott Brick. He's an actor and an award-winning, a writer. I don't want to forget that. And an award-winning audio, I don't know, what do you call that? Audiobook narrator?
I think we're
Is that
officially
right?
called narrators. Yeah.
Narrated, audiobook
Yeah.
narrator. So welcome, Scott.
Hi, Tony. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you here because, of course, I've listened to so many books. I'm at that stage of my life where while I still read if the e-reader, I also listen. So I never go a moment without having both going, right? So I'm reading one book, I'm listening to the narration of another.
Amen and amen. You're preaching to the choir.
And in your case, if I know you've narrated the book, I know I'm getting the audiobook, right? Right off the bat, I know. If it's you, it's like I want to hear Scott read it.
Tony, listen, I'm only going to give you 35, I don't know, maybe 40 minutes to stop saying nice things about me, and then I'm going to cut you off. But look, I do hear that, and I'm grateful every single time. I don't mean to be dismissive. I almost every email I get from a fan, I always sign off by saying thank you for listening, because I'm just grateful every time somebody does.
So I want to get into, because you've been everybody, right? You've been Jack Reacher. You've been everybody cool there is to be. You've got to narrate and be that person, which I don't think anybody else on the planet can say. Even actors who've maybe played one of them in a movie haven't played the amount of those super cool heroes you've gotten to play.
Yeah.
But I have to touch upon, because this is the first book I ever read that I got to hear you on, I want to say, was The Heist. The O'Hare and Fox.
Yes,
books,
the O'Hare and Fox
right?
series.
Janet
Yeah,
Ivanovich, of
Janet
course, and Lee
Ivanovich, of course.
Goldberg. Right. And that's, I think, the first time I became hooked on you reading me my audiobooks. And what's amazing to me is the two of them have incredible chemistry. If no one's ever read the books, very worth the read. And the two stars of the book, if you will, have incredible chemistry throughout. You're doing both parts. I mean, how does that happen?
Yeah, that's a thing. Primarily it's in the romance genre. What you might have are two narrators, a man and a woman, if that's what the couple is. If it's a male and female, they would hire me to do the man, and hire a woman to do the female parts. But that primarily happens in romance. For whatever reason, it doesn't really happen in action, adventure, thriller, mysteries, in those genres. So yeah, I get to play all the parts, and it's funny because I teach audiobook narration. I've my alma mater, UCLA, hired me to come back and teach their graduate acting program, audiobook narration, and everybody always focuses on that. If you're a man, how do I play a woman? If you're a woman, how do I play a man? And I said, the first thing you have to do is make your peace with the fact that you will never sound like the opposite sex. You're just never going, it's never going to happen. Right. You just, I don't know. I think there's a wonderful bit of advice that Dan Musselman gave me years ago. Dan Musselman was one of the producers at Penguin Random House. And when I was talking to him about how to convincingly play a female character, he said, well, if you hear it in your head, the listener will hear it in their ear. And that's really what I attribute it to. It's just do your best.
Yeah, because while I understand, you make every character sound different, right? No matter who it is, you can tell the difference, your inflection, your tone. I always wondered, like, can you capture like celebrities as well? Can you like copy other people's voices or no?
Yes, but it depends on which ones. You know, I can't. One time we were there were so many characters in this one book. I was at one point I was like, I think it was a book set in Nazi Germany. And what do you do when you've got 39 different Nazis that you have to portray, right? It's like, how do you make them sound different? And by the end, I was just begging the director, just please let me make this one General Burkhalter, you know, from Hogan's Heroes. Please let me just make this one Sergeant Schultz, please, you know. And I remember at one point I said, and he kept saying no, kept saying no. And I said, okay, let me at least do like a Christopher Walken. It's like, what do you mean, Christopher Walken? What are you talking about? I said, oh no, it won't be a character. I'll just do it on the chapter headings, you know, like chapter 39. You know, just to switch things up, but he just kept shaking his head. There actually are. I think there's a lot more. I don't want to call them impressions, you know, because I'm not an impressionist. But I'm a big fan of trying to replicate a certain performer's rhythm and cadence. In order to, you know, and I'll never sound like them. I'm not, you know, I'm not an impressionist, but there is a series that I do, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, by Stephen R. Donaldson. It's a marvelous fantasy series. And there is a race of beings who, with one another, they speak telepathically. With other humans, they had to learn human speech, but they wind up sounding unemotional. And it's described as being a very monotone delivery. And I'm like, oh, these are major characters. I can't do a monotone in an audiobook. That's a kiss of death. But I realized that sounds an awful lot like Mr. Spock. And so Leonard Nimoy, again, I will never sound like, you know, if in voiceover, there's a thing, you know, you're a vocal double, right? You can stand in for somebody if you're doing the voiceover. I'm never going to sound like Leonard Nimoy, but his rhythm and his cadence is very precise. And so rather than being a monotone, I could get away with what he did on that. The best line in Star Trek history is, "You are my superior officer. You are also my friend. I have been and always shall be yours." And that's very controlled,
Love
right?
it.
You know, right? And again, I'm not going to sound, my voice won't sound like Leonard Nimoy, but if I can capture the rhythm and the cadence, good enough.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Yeah, I mean, because you do every voice different, of course, and it's got to be a nightmare to keep track of, you know, when there's multiple characters throughout the book. Like, what did I do with this voice?
Right.
But because of the chemistry that the particular book I'm talking about, it's a series, you know, where the characters develop across. I want to say it's about 6 books now. And they have a lot of chemistry, and yet you're doing both parts. You're playing you're doing the voices, obviously different, and yet you're capturing this sexy banter chemistry. And that was fascinated by that. Like, it's like one person, but you'd never know.
Right.
Like, you'd never know. You managed to capture, and I guess that's the actor in you as well. But with kudos, I mean, really good job with that.
I'm grateful. Thank you. I always say that there's I the way I tend to look at my work and the work of my colleagues, you can strive for accuracy, or you can strive for authenticity. And I'll define my terms. Accuracy would be, you know, can I actually sound like a woman? Can I, if I'm playing a German-speaking character, can I nail the accent to a level that would make Meryl Streep proud, right? That's accuracy. But you can die accurate. And the fact of the matter is that is not authentic. That is not who I am. I'm not a woman. I'm not German. I'm a, you know, mumble-year-old white guy. And so, a white American, I should say. And so what I strive for is authenticity. And by authenticity, I mean the emotional authenticity of the scene. You know,
Wait,
what is most important? I always ask myself going into something I learned back at UCLA, if you're playing a character, and typically in those terms, you know, when I was in school, we were on stage, we were on camera, you know, you're playing one character. We were always encouraged to ask the questions, what does this character want? And what does this character need? Because it's not always the same thing. And in the case of an audiobook where I get to play all the characters, and specifically what you're talking about, the Fox and O'Hare series, Janet writes, I have to ask that question about a lot of different characters. You know, who's the protagonist? Who's the antagonist? What do they want? What does this other one want? So it's
is that your
fascinating.
creative process? I mean,
Mm.
what is your creative process going into, a new book? I mean, arguably you've made, all the top writers, if you go down the New York Times list, any given moment, half the books were narrated by you. Right. So you're definitely at the top of your field. But how do you approach each new project? Because you do capture that authenticity you're talking about, right? That's what makes you so popular. I love listening to your audiobooks because I know it's going to be a wild ride, right? I know I'm going to enjoy it. I'm really going to get into the characters, and you're going to make more out of the characters than maybe even the page did, right? Because I'm a firm believer, even with making movies or television shows, it's very collaborative. So you have the
Absolutely.
writer who certainly, makes paper person, right? And then you have the director, right, who brings their vision to it, the actor who gives each person their character, their nuances, right, their quirkiness, their whatever they're capturing the essence of that person. They're personifying them, certainly,
Right.
right. And you have the cinematographer who may weave you visually through it,
Hmm.
right. So you have all these people to collaborate to make the final product. Now, ordinarily with a book, there isn't that. There's your mind and the paper.
Hmm.
Uh, but with audiobooks, you get a chance to do that again. It's collaborative again.
Yeah.
So now you're bringing to life paper person.
Right.
And that's an art form, because I have listened to books who I've stopped the audio just not to have to listen to that person go through to the end, right? Where
Right.
it's just like, oh my goodness, it's terrible. Like, it's just terrible.
Yeah.
Like, and I can't do it. And I wind up just, all right, if I want to continue the book, I just buy the book and read it
Mhm.
myself. So that is a talent. You have to be creatively doing something amazing that pops those characters. What do you do? What is your creative process before you begin?
Um, just to go back to something you were talking about, all the various jobs, the collaborative process. Um, I think one of the nicest things that was ever said about me was from the author Brad Meltzer. He writes thrillers, and
Yeah, yeah.
he's just he's one of the dearest men I've ever met. He's a beloved friend of mine, and he uh, was asked about us working together, and he likened it to Elton John and Bernie Taupin. I just blew me away. But he said, you know, that's a very successful duo, and you'll notice one writes the words, the other writes the melody. And he says, I'm the word guy. Scott brings the music. And so I like you. I think it's a very collaborative process. Although I never kid myself. I'm like, look, all I had to do was read it out loud. You know, Brad was the one who had to actually write the words. I I'll tell you what I do when I get a new book. The first thing I do is I address the pronunciations. That's just from a technical perspective. We you just have to get them right. You know, you got the city of Houston, and then you got the street, you know, Houston in Manhattan, right?
Mm.
You know,
Right.
They're going to be pronounced. They have to be pronounced differently. Same thing with there's an area. I live in Los Angeles, and there's an area near the Hollywood sign called Los Feliz. And like most other things in Los Angeles in Southern California, it's based on the Spanish language. So it would technically be Los Feliz, but it's not. You have to make sure that you get everything right. If I'm working on a Dune book, I handle those pronunciations myself. Um, um, I've got a great relationship with the authors, Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. And Brian is the son of Frank Herbert, who began the whole saga 25 volumes ago. And I want to make sure, both of us want to make sure that we are pronouncing the words in this franchise the same way that Frank did. And Brian is the best way to address that, to make sure that we have that kind of authenticity. So that's what I do on a Dune book. But if it's a thriller, I just finished the latest Jason Bourne novel. And thankfully, our producer-director on that series, Jessica Kay, she looked up all of the words and phrases that needed to be spoken in languages not my own. But if I'm working alone, then I have to do that myself. Fortunately, I have a researcher, George Weisberg, lovely guy, and I've never been able to stump him. Every single word or phrase I've given him, he's always come back. And part of me, it's almost like just pure cussedness. I'm like, I'm gonna hit him I'm gonna get him with this one. I'm gonna win. I'm gonna stump him. But yeah, so far he's gotten them all right. So that's what I do. But again, that's not really me doing that work. It's the director doing that. It's my researcher doing that. What I do is I approach it from a performance standpoint. The very first thing, and this is with a novel, fiction rather than nonfiction, what I do is I have to identify the protagonist. And most people, if you're asked, who's the protagonist, you would say, well, it's the lead character. But that's not the case. The protagonist is the character who changes. And, in Star Trek, it's not Captain Kirk, it's Mr. Spock. Spock is the one who changes. In The Big Bang Theory, the series that loves Star Trek, it's not Leonard, it's Sheldon. Even though Johnny Galecki, the guy who plays Leonard, is number one in the credits, and it's Sheldon who actually changes over the course of the series. I have to identify who that character is.
Who's going to evolve?
Exactly. What is the evolution, not just of the characters, but of the story itself? And what I do then is I have to determine, what is the change, and then make sure that I map it out accordingly. If the character begins somehow intolerant, whether it be of another race, a gender, sexual identity, whatever it is, whatever the character begins as, if he's intolerant of someone, but then at the end, if it's like the movie Giant, right? Rock Hudson begins as a rather intolerant character, and then at the end, he gets the crap beat out of him for standing up for a black family who was denied service at a restaurant. And okay, well, you start here, you end here. What I have to do is basically create this arc. I just, that's what it is. It's technically and physically, it is an arc. And I have to make sure that every single time that the topic of intolerance comes up, I just raise the stakes a little bit and I move along that arc so that by the time we get here to the very end, it's not a surprise when Rock Hudson,
Yeah.
Rock Hudson's character has that happen. It can't come as a surprise. I have to make sure that it.
I was just wondering if you ever got to a point where you were reading a character, right?
Mhm.
And you got midway through or some portion through and you felt like, you know what? This isn't the vibe. Like, then I'll assume you read all the books. Let me preface this by saying I'm
Sure.
assuming you read them before you read them, if you know what I mean. Like that
Yes.
you're already, that you're not seeing the material new as you're narrating. I'll
I
assume that. So
I have done that, but it's always best to not go in cold.
so that you have some idea of the journey,
Yes.
going in. But I feel like if I go back and read certain books,
Mhm.
I get something new out of them every time I do. Right. The more meaningful books, like maybe there's little nuances I missed, the first time around. So if it's a really important book, or I really enjoyed it, sometimes I'll take the journey again. Like I'll let a year go by and maybe take that journey again.
Sure.
But when you're going through and something new hits you about it, like, oh, I didn't catch that this character was this or that. And I feel like that has to happen to you, even if you
Mhm.
prepared in advance. Like as you're narrating them, you're breathing life into them. You have to get somewhere along the way and go, I don't know. You know what? I feel like this could be a little different. Like I mean, you have to see something or feel something once in a while. That has to happen. That you feel like, did I capture the essence? And now I want to do
Yes.
it a little different.
No, 100%. My fiance, Suzanne Elise Freeman, she's a narrator as well, and we were cast together on a book about a year ago. It was called Intergalactic Exterminators, Inc. Um, really fun title, science fiction, of course. Um, and I had not read the book beforehand, before she recorded her part of it. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes you have a man and a woman. If the POV character in a certain chapter is a woman, okay, great. Those are the ones that Suzanne read. The POV characters written from a male point of view, those were the chapters that I read. And
Interesting. Can
she,
I just interrupt you for 1 second and,
of
and
course,
ask this question while it's in my head? So you don't record them at the same time having the conversation.
no,
No, you do your part and she does her part. That's how that usually works. Oh, okay.
because typically what happens is entire chapters are read by one single narrator. Again, the woman, Suzanne's going to read those. The man, I will read those. Sometimes, if it's a scene where the dialogue goes back and forth, and they actually
Right.
hire two of us, it's that's extraordinarily rare, but it does happen. And in those cases, I have been in the studio with other people, and we've just read across the microphone to one another. It
Okay.
doesn't
Yeah.
happen very often. It's kind of a technical nightmare for the editors. It's a lot more work than getting one chapter by him, one chapter by her, and just putting them in order. Um, so that's the way that we did this book. And she was going to record her chapters before I went in to do mine. And at that point, I had not read the book, but I had skimmed it enough to know, what was going on. And the night before she went in to do her part, we covered all the major characters and, like, well, how should this person sound? What should this person sound like? And there was a character in that particular book, the Intergalactic Exterminators, um, uh, a robot who, over the course of the book, becomes sentient, right? He becomes, you know, far more human-like. And I remember, I think I had come up with this idea that, like, oh, maybe we should make him sound like, I don't know, Alan Rickman or somebody. I don't know. I'm just picking that name at random. Just because I love him as an actor. And I was like, it got that kind of detached sound, that kind of detached vibe to his performances. And And that just seemed right in the moment, but I wasn't in the booth yet. She goes into the booth the next day, she records it, all is well. I go in the following week to do mine. And the moment I started reading that character, I realized, oh no, that's not the right way to go. And to be honest, I based it off of a dear friend of ours, Ray Porter. He's one of the best known audiobook narrators out there. He's actually going to be in our wedding party. Dear friend, and he had done this one character in a science fiction novel that he read that I just adored. And I thought, no, this can't sound like, Alan Rickman. It has to sound like Ray Porter. And so what we had to do is I emailed the director, the producer of the book, and I said, I screwed up. I recorded my versions, my chapters a totally different way. Fortunately, that character only, I don't know, maybe a few dozen times showed up in Suzanne's chapters. But when both of us went to record our pickups, it happens in every book, you say, a shooting spree instead of shopping spree, things just come out, you get it wrong. Okay, great. Then you re-record it and the editor plugs it back in. We both went in to do our pickups for that book on the same day, same studio, and we re-recorded all of her lines when she had to play that character. And I was actually in the booth with her, and she's like, okay, how are you going to make it sound? And I basically did my Ray Porter impersonation, and she just repeated it back. And the happy third act to that story is that it actually just won the science fiction audiobook Audie Award.
Oh, well, congratulations to both of you.
Thank you very much. It was our first book together, and ours first Audie win together. So it was lovely.
Well, congratulations. That is a pretty cool story.
Well, if for no other reason than all the extra work that we put into it, which was entirely my fault.
But that sounds reasonable in terms of an approach. I have to believe that there's times that you're midway through and you're going, sure, I don't know, this guy suddenly speaks to me in a different way.
Yeah, there's a wonderful series by Justin Cronin called The Passage. It was a 3-book series. The first volume, The Passage, the second one was called The 12, and then the third one was The City of Mirrors. And it is the most realistic take on vampirism, really, I think, since Richard Matheson wrote I Am Legend. It's the idea that vampirism is a virus. And as with any virus, you always look for, who is patient zero. And there is a character in the book that's what he's called. He's called Zero. But you have no idea who he is. In the first 2 volumes, you have no idea who he is, where he came from, what his accent might be, his socioeconomic background, nothing, none of that. But I had to do a number of lines in his voice. So how do you choose a voice when you know nothing about that character? Well, my only indication was that those lines of dialogue were in italics, right? So they're slanted, and I'm like, so what would that mean? Italics are usually used if somebody is speaking in a different language, or italics are quite often used if it is the internal monologue rather than the external dialogue. And in this case, it was a mental thing. Zero could speak to all of those whom he had infected, all of the people that he had turned into vampires himself. He could speak to them telepathically, and kept saying the same thing over and over. No punctuation, no periods, no commas, nothing. It was just the same phrase over and over and over. Come to me. He was summoning them. And so what I did in order to get, you know, the creepiness factor, what I did is I leaned into the microphone and I lowered my volume and I said, "Come to me, come 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 to me."
Okay, you freaked me out. Okay.
Well, thank you. Achievement unlocked. But it's, you know, it seemed appropriate because that's what was going on, you know, and because the guy's a vampire. Well, in the third volume of the saga, you learn who Zero is. You learn where he's from, what country he's from, what part of that country he's from. You learn his socioeconomic background. And I would have chosen, had I known that at the beginning, 7 years earlier when the first volume came out, I likely would have made a different choice. But at this point, we've already recorded 2 books with me essentially using that voice. It's not really a voice. It's just me getting close and whispering in your ear. But suddenly I had to do 150 pages from his point of view, first person, him just telling his origin story. And the director and I had a kind of the come to Jesus moment. Well, what do we do now? The voice I've been using may not have been appropriate. Do we change it? And she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to keep doing the same thing I've been doing. Because the fact of the matter is, in that circumstance, the character, you know, you got a vampire who's a couple of 100 years old, and somebody comes to confront him. And essentially what he was saying in the book was, you know, oh, so you want to know my story, you want to know who I am. Well, then I'll tell you. And I said, he just seems really kind of affected, right? A bit larger than life, quite theatrical. The guy was, you know, quoting Shakespeare left and right. So I said, I just want to do the same thing. And the director had to tell the editor what was going on, because when you get that close to the microphone, any time you hit a plosive, you know, anything that starts with a P, you know, it's going to pop on the microphone. And so there's, you know, there was going to be more work for the editor to do. But ultimately what wound up happening is, for 150 pages over the course of 2 days, I just leaned into the microphone and I said, so you want to know who I am? You wish to know my story? Very well then, I shall tell you. And
I
it
have
works.
chills.
Well,
I have chills.
you know, I remember thinking, I'm going to get killed for this. People are going to hate it. But I don't mind making a bold choice. I figure if you're going to make a choice, make it a bold one. You know, if I get carried out, they can carry me out on my shield. And as it turns out, whenever I hear from fans, it's that section of the book that they speak of the most.
Yeah.
But as you were saying, you know, there's a difference between reading and, you know, there's a difference between the page and then lifting it off the page. And I think sometimes it's as a result of making a choice like that. Thank God that one worked out.
Now I have to ask you, I mean, you played Jack Reacher, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what's that like?
It's one of the coolest things in the world to play Jack Reacher. And I remember at one point I had a 3 week
Cooler than
stretch.
Jason Bourne?
Okay, well, that you clearly were reading my mind. I had a 3-week stretch where I went from playing Jason Bourne to Jack Ryan in the Tom Clancy novels
Sure.
to Jack Reacher. And I just remember at the end of those 3 weeks, I'm just walking around. Suzanne will
Right.
tell you, she's, you know, I'm walking around, I'm like, I'm feeling like a badass. That's what I'm feeling like. It was, that was a good 3 weeks. Yeah, it's the ultimate wish fulfillment. the ultimate fantasy come true. And okay,
Oh,
so
that's got to be followed by I Love My Life, right?
totally, totally. I
Like,
just remember thinking, every single time I work on a Jack Reacher novel, I just remember thinking, huh, yeah, next time somebody looks at me crosswise at the supermarket, I'm gonna hammer them down. If only I was able to right the wrongs that Reacher does. I had a pretty extraordinary thing happen. In 2010, I went to Rome with a friend named Robert Hicks. He's since passed away. He was a lovely, lovely man and a best-selling author. He wrote Widow of the South. It's one of the best historical novels you'll ever come across. And he has a number of author friends. And so I found myself with about 30 other people celebrating his birthday, which also is my birthday. Suddenly we're in Rome, and I'm having a birthday party in Rome, of all things. And there was this wonderful couple, Andrew Grant and Tasha Alexander. I wasn't aware of either one of their works at the time. He's British, she's American, and we were in the backseat of a cab on our way somewhere, and they're asking me, so audiobooks, that sounds fascinating. How does that work? And we're talking, and they both said to me, because both are authors, they said, could we work together? Maybe you could do one of our books. And I said, well, I hate to tell you, I'm likely never going to wind up getting chosen to do one of your books because a couple different reasons. Tasha, you're a woman, I am not. It's more appropriate that a woman reads your novels, especially because it's a female perspective, a female primary character. And Andrew, you're British and I'm not. And okay, occasionally I can turn on the accent if I have to, but you don't want to hear 300 pages of that. It's just not authentic. And this conversation would happen whenever we would run into one another. As recently as 5 years ago, we were at a writers' conference, and I had just taken over the Reacher books at that point. And well, come to find out that Andrew is the brother of Lee Child. Lee Child's real name is Jack Grant. And Lee Child is his nom de plume, and he announced his retirement. He's going to be retiring, and in the meantime, rather than ending the series, he's like, well, I'm going to hand it off to the person that I trust most, the person who has like proofread every single manuscript of every single Reacher book that's come out, his brother Andrew, who is also a renowned author himself. He's like, we just have to make sure that you change your last name so it's Lee Child and Andrew Child. And
I love this.
yes, so suddenly I'm getting to do my friend's book. The guy who told him twice on 2 different continents, no, I'll never get to do one of your books. That's never going to happen because you write British characters. Well, now he's writing Jack Reacher. And for the last handful of titles, both brothers have been working on the series. So I did wind up getting to work on Andrew's books after all. And I couldn't be happier.
That's a great antidote.
Yeah, turned out great.
So I also listened to Wells, The Invisible Man.
Oh, sure.
Right. I went back occasionally. I'm a little odd this way. Once in a while, I like to go back and read classics, things that I read maybe for the first time in college.
Nothing odd about
like that. Right. Yeah. So, and I haven't read them in a lot of years. And I think just that my perspective is different, at this stage of my life than it was when I was first presented with a lot of that work. So I will often go back and I decided I was browsing really in the section of classics, just seeing what I wanted to pick up. And I saw that you read it, and you were the narrator. So I said, I have to get the audiobook. It is so unbelievably good.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you say that. It's actually one of the first books I ever did. I think I was in the first year of my career, probably around. Well, I started in 1999. I imagine I got hired for that one in 2000 or 2001.
But you,
long enough
yeah,
long
still
enough
great.
ago that I barely remember it. You know, I remember that I did it, but and I remember where I was. I remember where the booth was, but other than that, not. Yeah.
I guess I was wondering, is it more daunting to do a classic? Like, because you've done some Shakespeare, you've read,
Hmm.
and and to do Wells. I mean, you've done some seriously classic works. Is it more daunting
It
than,
is.
yeah?
Yeah.
I wondered that, and I thought it has to be that has to carry with it a certain burden.
To be honest, there's a class, as I mentioned, I teach at UCLA now, and there's one class every quarter that I teach. I only do it one quarter a year, but for the 10 weeks that I teach it, one class period is devoted, 3 hours devoted to the choices that you make when you're working on a classic. And I always, to be honest, I use the example of Frankenstein, um, because that is arguably, I mean, even more famous than the Invisible Man, right? You know, just
Sure.
because of
Hollywood.
Boris Karloff, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And you know, there's always the challenge of what do you do when you get to something that is so much a part of pop culture. Um, I've done a lot of novels that wound up being, you know, turned into classic films. I did The Graduate. Okay, what do you do when you get to that line at the end, Elaine, 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 you know, him interrupting the wedding? Do you do it exactly like, you know, Dustin Hoffman did? Or do you try to make it your own? Do you try to reinterpret?
And what
I
did you
did,
do?
I did. Oh, I went with Hoffman. I was like, oh no, there's I'm sorry, there's no improving on perfection. I did Heart of Darkness, and what do you do? You know, what do you do when you get to that line from Apocalypse Now? You know, the horror, the horror. You know, yeah, of course you go with the Brando impression. But in Frankenstein, the difference is, you know, the most recognizable thing about Boris Karloff's performance was the growling, right? You know, "Rawr," you know. Um, in the novel, 40% of it, 45% of it is told from his point of view. And you just can't growl for 45% of the novel.
No.
Because, first of all, you know, that would fatigue my vocal cords, but it would also fatigue the listener's ear. So you have to ask yourself these questions like, okay, well, then how should he sound? Um, how do you choose an accent? I mean, he is assembled piecemeal, right? Part of this corpse, part of that corpse. Um, you know, where does accent come from? Is it um, nature or nurture? You know, just because your parents are English, okay, fine. Raise him in Texas. How's he going to sound? Then I had to get into, well, would the monster have any vocal cords at all? I mean, if his head was severed, that would sever the laryngeal nerve, and there's no coming back from that. Which ultimately wound up being the choice that I made. Um, I read a wonderful piece online, and you don't go through this when it's not a classic. This is the extra pressure that you bring to a classic. I went online and I read a number of treatises um, about Frankenstein, and one of them I was fascinated by. There's a school of thought that says that the monster does not exist, that Victor Frankenstein had a psychotic break, and
Oh,
is similar to Fight Club. He
yeah.
was interacting with himself, the best and worst parts of himself.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was fascinated by that. I think that because in the novel, there's no attention given whatsoever to the creation of the monster.
Right.
He just says, I created it, you know. And he talks about being in this mental fever, you know, this brain fog that he was going through. And ultimately he wound up having uh, um, you know, just mentally collapsed afterward because he was so exhausted. And I was like, I honestly think that could be the case. So what I did is I created an accent for Victor, and then all I did for the monster is the exact same accent, but I whispered it because people who've had their laryngeal nerve severed, they can't do anything more than a whisper. So, and I thought that would make them sound close enough to one another, that if you subscribed to this theory that there was no monster, then okay, this was consistent. Plus, I remembered that marvelous performance. It was Brian Blessed. I'm trying to remember who played the ghost of King Hamlet in Kenneth Branagh's version of the play. There's a moment where when King Hamlet appears as a ghost to his son, Prince Hamlet, he whispers the whole time. And I'll just never forget the sound of him saying, when he's commanding him to listen, he says, "List, list, oh, list." And I found it compelling. Sometimes you can say so much without raising your voice. That anyway, that's the choice I made for that classic. And to answer a very, very long answer to a very short question, yeah, there's a lot
No. I mean, that's the kind of thing
pressure.
I love to delve into, because I think there's such, I don't know what the word is, but respect, I guess, we have for what we deem to be our classics in literature. And to do them justice so many years later, and this can't be an easy task. And I figured, I was curious, like, you have to be approaching that has to feel a little bit more daunting. You're certainly creating characters that have been done in movies and in other ways. On stage and and on film, that I just figured it had to be a daunting task, and wanting to stay true to those writers, to those classic writers. Just curious with what your process was and if it was any different, because a lot of times I think when you get your books, especially if you've been reading them from the original, people don't think much about it. But sure, if you go back to Jason Bourne #1, I mean, he's evolved, as the series has gone on, but you couldn't have imagined, I don't think, when the series first started, that he would become who he became, like, or that the books would become as magnificent as they've become, and such part of almost Americana, right? They're so popular that the movies, besides the books, and I would argue the author's probably gotten many people reading who didn't read so much before, right? Who maybe caught the first movie or two and then jumps into the next novel that comes out before even the movie comes out. So
it is. And I think there's a responsibility that goes along with that, because you realize, maybe this is somebody's first novel that they're reading. It's their first audiobook that they're hearing. And if that's the case, I want to make sure that they come back for a second time. Classics are classics because they've stood the test of time. And I've gotten to do some wonderful ones, but in the case of, Jason Bourne, the Bourne Identity was the first one. That came out in the 70s. I recorded it about 15 years ago. The Hunt for Red October came out, I think, in the late 80s. Don't quote me on that, but I recorded that about 5 years ago. Jurassic Park came out 25 years ago. I only recorded that 5 years ago. I think because all three of those had been turned into wonderful classic films and had become iconic, that suddenly there's a whole lot more pressure when you're working on a series like that. It's like, well, I better do it justice. I remember, and now I'm blanking on the character's name, the Russian sub-commander. At one point, I put in a Scottish accent into the audiobook just because it's Sean Connery, how can you not? Yeah,
Yeah.
but
So
it's,
do you
was it,
have a favorite? I have to ask, do you have a favorite book ever
oh,
that you narrated? Or should I not ask? They're all your creations and
that's tough. I've done over 1,000 books at this point, and it's really hard to pick one.
yeah.
Um, but I can absolutely point to a handful. Uh, um, Jurassic Park was a dream to work on, um, as was The Hunt for Red October. Um, In Cold Blood was like
Truman Capote. I
yeah,
haven't
a
gotten to
dream
hear
come
your
true.
version of that, but it has to be, oh, chilling.
You know, I point to that book a lot, because it's something that wound up happening years later. I want to say I recorded it 10, 15 years ago. Easily 5 years later, there was a reporter at the New York Times who she's a political reporter, but she was doing an op-ed piece. Um, and it was about the glory of audiobooks. She had just discovered them, and the reason she discovered them is because she was going on the campaign trail and she was following Hillary Clinton from state to state to state, and suddenly, like most people in Manhattan, you know, she didn't drive. Well, she had to learn to drive, and what is she going to do with so many hours on the road? She decided to listen to audiobooks. And she had a really great idea. She said, okay, while going through the South, she read books about, racial justice, racial injustice. Um, uh, um, and what she tried to do was tailor her listening experience to the community that she found herself in. It's a great idea. And when she was driving through Kansas, she decided to listen to In Cold Blood. And as an aside, she said she was so freaked out by my reading of it that at one point late at night, she's at a gas station, filling up her tank, and she looks across the road to a farm, and she said she convinced herself it was the Clutter Farm, the infamous site of the murders at the beginning of the book. And she convinced herself that's where it happened. That's where it happened. She said she was so freaked out she had to like dive back into her car, and she was so unnerved by it. And I remember thinking, huh, I recorded that book easily 5 years before that, but people are still being frightened.
Oh, it
And
would
that
have to. I mean, the book in and of itself is, it's it's a scary book to
it
read,
is,
although not, intended to be. It's not intended to
but
be,
certainly not a horror novel or
a
anything like
horror
that.
novel. Yeah, I couldn't think of the word.
But
Thank you.
to me, it showed that listening is every bit as part of the experience as the narration. That, yes, I am reading these words aloud, but the work is not done. The listening is an active experience, and it continues long after my time in the booth is done.
Oh, I think I want to check that out now. I didn't realize you had read that one, narrated that one. That has to be a chilling read. I do want to check that one out.
I have to say, I got about again, we talked earlier about, whether you read the book ahead of time. Um, I only got about 150 pages into that, and I had to stop reading it because it's disturbing.
It is.
And I knew it was going to be very difficult to read some of those sections once, let alone twice. The prep time and the time behind the mic. And so I don't know if I'd call this cheating or not, but what I did is I after about page 125 thereabouts, I set it down and I rented both the film and the remake that they did. I want to say it was a made for TV, like a mini series, something like that. Anthony Edwards from ER was one of the killers in it. So I made sure I immersed myself in it, but I was like, I can't deal with reading these words
I don't think
twice.
film version captured the essence of the book, to be honest with you.
It's
The
hard.
book, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it really is. It's hard to do a classic, and but also that was really a genre bending book because it's a novelization of a true crime story. Had never been done before.
Right.
So it was, yeah, they definitely set themselves up for a huge challenge, definitely.
So I can't let you go. I know I'm running out of time with you. I can't let you go though without talking about your debut novel, Insight.
Oh, this is very nice of you. Thank you.
So tell me, how exciting was it to write your first novel, and tell me about it.
Thank you. Well, it's been talk about a challenge. Uh, it's very, it was very rewarding. And it convinced me of the fact that there's truth in an author will tell another author, if asked for advice, she will say, write the book that you want to read. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Similarly, that there's a lot of truth from the narration perspective. Write the book that you want to narrate. And I remember as I was writing it, it was, oh God, I can't wait to say this out loud. Or sometimes avoiding things that I might have put in, but which I knew would not go well in the booth. Years ago, I was working on a science fiction novel, and there were these guy goes into a crypt, and there's these 1,000-year-old, 20-foot tall magic pumas. Yeah. And there was the word growl. Instead of saying it growled, the author wrote out the word growl, but he moved it from, the left margin to the right margin. The whole line was growl. 5 G's, 5 R's, 5 O's, 5 W's, and 5 L's. And I was like, I'm sorry, I ain't gonna say the word growl. As it turns out, what I did is I just improv'd. I leaned into the mic and I went, I did that instead. I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say growl.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, and in the same way, authors quite often will have somebody scream in terror. That's not going to sound good on an audiobook. It's just not going to. So anyway, I found myself eliminating all of those things, but still making it the story I wanted to read, and the story that I wanted to say out loud. And wouldn't you know it, I spoke earlier about how it's most appropriate when if a book is written by a man, the man narrated it. If a book is written by a woman, then a woman narrated. Of course, Frankenstein being a famous exception because it's entirely from a male POV, even though it was Mary Shelley who wrote it. My book is from a female detective's perspective. If it was anybody else who wrote it, nope. There isn't a publisher alive who would have cast me to do it, but that's okay. I'll still wind up getting to read it myself.
Will you get to read your own?
Oh God, they're gonna have to pry that thing out of my cold dead fingers if anybody else tries to grab it. There's no way. No, that's in the contract.
That's pretty cool.
Darn right. Yeah. And
Getting to read your own would be really cool.
Yeah, it's funny every
right?
now and again. Yeah.
I mean, knowing it's your own after, well, and there's got to be pressure to it, right? Too, as well. I'm thinking about it. Like here, you've gone in and you've read Tom Clancy and Brad Meltzer and John Grisham, right? And I know Lee Child. I mean, all these. I mean, so there's got to be pressure when you go in to do your own to live up to that level. Yeah.
While working on it. my fear was that any one of those authors would read it and say, yeah, don't quit your day job.
Well, tell us about the book. It's not out yet, I don't believe.
No, it's not. It's basically the primary thrust of the story is it begins with a murder, and a detective is called in. Gwen is her name, and she's called in to investigate the crime, and finds out that the only witness is blind. And so of course nobody takes him seriously. But she has to, because the crime that he's describing is clearly not the crime that occurred at the beginning of the book. But what he's describing was the murder of her husband several years earlier that still remains unsolved. So she needs to believe him. Nobody takes him seriously, but she needs to, because he knows so much about what happened to her husband. And yeah.
Wow, that is a kind of a unique twist.
Well, I love the idea of, anybody who's watched a Law and Order, you see that certain witnesses' testimony can be impeached. Certain witnesses can be proven unreliable. Well, what happens when you want a witness to be reliable, but nobody else thinks he is? But to you, he has to be. You're so invested in it. That was basically the motivation for writing it.
Well, I also think what's an interesting spin on what you just said is your emphasis all these years on narration is what you can capture through the person's ear. All right. You're not putting a film together where you can give them the visual, which allows you to say a lot less when you have a visual, right? You have to put everything into what somebody can glean from their ears and not their eyes. And I think to make a witness be blind, it would be ordinarily you'd feel dismissive of that. But for people with disabilities, certainly they do hear more than we do, more than somebody who has vision, right? They have a way of telling you things that have almost more power to them than somebody who could have witnessed the person. All right, because they pick up a scent, a little nuance of a noise, a little crack open of something, things that you may miss visually, but somebody who's reliant completely on the ear might not. So I think that's interesting, especially given your background is you're catering to people who are listening to the story, and then to give them a key witness whose basic way of telling what he knows is through what he heard. That's interesting. It's fascinating.
Well, thank you. I found myself, God, I did so much research while working on that. And as you say, I think the easiest thing to do, I think far too easy, is to dismiss the capability of somebody who is missing any of their senses. I can tell you, my friend Lewis is blind, and I've brought him in to speak to my audiobook class at UCLA because he's got insight. Well, I really didn't mean to, pun unintended. He has insights into the storytelling experience that nobody else does, that sighted people certainly do.
Right.
And fascinating guy.
When will it be out?
To be determined. Still working on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I hope when it comes out, you'll come back and talk to me, right? Like
anytime. I will talk to you anytime, and I'm happy to follow up about it because you can ask me how many times while recording this did you utter the phrase, "Who wrote this anyway?" which I
No, now,
anticipate saying a lot.
right now I have to, of course I have to read it. And I
Oh,
have to listen to your narration of it, of course, but then we can come back and we can talk about it and I can pick
that'd be
apart your
great.
brain for what were you thinking here and what were you thinking here?
Happy to.
Well,
Happy
thank
to
you so
anytime.
much.
This has been a real
Thank you.
pleasure. I'm really grateful.
I'm grateful that you came to talk to me. Wow, really have been a fan of yours for a lot of years. And I'm
Thank
not
you,
just
Tony.
saying that. If I see that you are the narrator on the book, I absolutely pick up the audiobook instead of the book.
I'm
Um,
grateful.
because it's just, and if anybody listening or watching this, has not enjoyed a book read by Scott, my goodness, go run right out. Don't even stop and watch the end. Like run right out and get one, because he just takes you on a thrill ride. I mean, the story, I want to say, is even better than it is on the page. Because just to test out my theory, I've done it. I've read books where I read the book and then I listened to your narration, and you made the story better. You just did. So I
don't even know
thank
what
you
to
for
say.
doing what you do. I try
you.
to never miss a book if I know it's narrated by you now at this point. So
Thank you, Tony. I'm grateful. Really am. I'm grateful. As I mentioned earlier, when I get an email from folks, I always say thank you for listening, and I'm really grateful that you do. So thank you.
excellent. So I'm going to close out the podcast, but I promise that I'm going to nag Scott until he comes back to talk to me about his new book.
Done.
I'll stay on this. Thank you.
Thank you.